You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Now, let's talk about a defensive tackle from Marshall. Marshall, of course, having huge problems with their football program. Syracuse football appears to be targeting Marshall defensive tackle Chris Thomas Jr. in the transfer portal. Thomas is 6'6", 330 pounds, and he is a run-stuffing defensive tackle. That sounds pretty nice. What do you think? Run-stuffing defensive tackle. I think they can use that. I'll explain why later on here in this segment. Thomas has spent the last 2 years at Marshall and the previous 2 seasons at Florida. He's got 1 more year of eligibility remaining, and he posted on his Twitter account, so I'm getting this information from Chris Thomas himself, that Syracuse has put out an offer for him. That means they're interested. Clearly, right? Again, it's coming from Chris Thomas himself on Twitter. I also do believe he is the older brother of a 2025 commit for the Orange, Eric Thomas. So that could be pretty cool having the siblings. And Eric Thomas is also a defensive lineman for what it's worth. But back to Chris. He had a solid year last season with Marshall. He's a starting defensive tackle, over 40 tackles, 4 tackles for loss. And Marshall, by the way, went 10-3 this season. They were a pretty good team in the Sun Belt. So that's good. You're getting a starter potentially from, it's a group of 5, but still could be good. And I like his size at 6'6", 330 pounds. That's size that can translate to a power 4 level. Overall, you can never have enough defensive line depth. Like you just can't. Can you? Is there such thing as enough? I don't think so. I think the cornerstone of the defensive line is Murad Watson. Murad Watson was a true freshman this past season, and I honestly didn't have high expectations for him. He was a consensus 3-star guy, but he was a starter for Syracuse. And recently by 24/7 Sports, he was named a true freshman All-American. So he's clearly the building block of this defensive line, Murad Watson. But a guy like Chris Thomas could be the perfect pairing alongside of him. And like I said, with his size, he should be able to translate to the power 4 level. And he spent 2 seasons at Florida as well. He didn't really play at Florida, but he was there. And he was at Marshall, which is group of 5. I also don't know necessarily if Chris Thomas would start if he were to commit to Syracuse, because if you're looking at the depth, there's Rashard Perry, Isaiah Hastings, there's others, but also a guy like Dion Wilson. Dion Wilson this year, nicknamed Tank Wilson, I believe he was a transfer from New Mexico. He had 1 more year of eligibility left, but he dealt with injuries this season, and he only played in 4 games, which is below or right at the threshold for what you need for a redshirt year. It's 4 or less games. So I'm very curious to know if Dion Wilson has another year of eligibility, but regardless, I mean, you're not going to say no to Chris Thomas just because Dion Wilson might be back. The other thing I like about Thomas, and I said this already, but he is a run-stuffing defensive tackle. And the Orange certainly need someone like that. They do. Look at the numbers from last season. What was the big weakness of Syracuse? What was it? You followed along, 9-win regular season, could be 10 wins in the bowl game. They were pretty good at a lot of things. Obviously, you got to be pretty good in order to win 9 games. Except they did a really not so great job of stopping the run. Compared to the rest of the ACC, Syracuse led up the 3rd most rushing yards per game. Already not off to a great start. But what if teams were just running the ball a lot on Syracuse just because? For the fun of it, right? Well, if you look at yards per carry, which might be a better stat to use, the Orange were the only team in the ACC to let up over 5 yards per carry. It was like Syracuse at 5.2. Clemson, shockingly, is the second worst. They're at like 4.6, though. 5.2 yards per carry. Think about that for a moment. That means that an opponent could run 2 run plays on average and get a first down. So they need some run stuffing in there. They need some meat in the middle. And I think a guy like Chris Thomas could be a perfect fit for this team. So my overall thoughts on this? I think there's still a while to go while he's been offered. I am not sure if a visit is in order yet. I imagine there will be. I mean, he's the older brother of a Syracuse 2025 commit. It makes a lot of sense. Syracuse can use a defensive lineman. He's coming from Marshall. They were a pretty good team in the group of 5. He was a starter. This could be a good move. I like it. Leave a comment in the comments section below your thoughts on Chris Thomas. Do you think that he would automatically start for the Orange next season? And how do you like the fit? And honestly, how many defensive linemen do they need in the portal? I think that's a legitimate question, because if they get Chris Thomas, they might be set at defensive line for next season.